I can still remember the cool, delicate touch of the champagne glass in my hand, that afternoon the tiny bubbles rising like my spirits after 6 relentless months of late nights and silent grit. We had just closed the largest deal in Northbridge Dynamics' history, $18 million, sealed by my own blood, sweat, and no small measure of sacrifice. I didn't expect confetti or applause, but I certainly didn't expect the office door to swing open without a knock, and for 2 faces tight-lipped and stare-lato appear like shadows at the edge of a celebration. My name is Diane Mallory. I'm 57 years old. I served as strategy director at Northbridge, a mid-sized tech firm based in Minneapolis, for nearly 7 years. Not once did I call in sick until my body made the decision for me. 8 months ago, I was diagnosed with early-stage pancreatic cancer, a quiet bomb in the middle of my life. I chose to keep it to myself, started treatment quietly, and kept showing up, never letting the illness dull my edge. I worked through the nausea, the fatigue, the silent fear gnawing at me during midnight spreadsheet reviews. I didn't want sympathy. I wanted dignity. I believed loyalty still mattered. I thought my late-night strategy sessions, the times I reworked pitch decks while the CEO fumbled through another investor meeting, the weekends I skipped family gatherings to salvage client relationships, meant something. I truly believed that showing up, even with an IV bruise on my arm and a pain I never admitted to anyone, would count for something. I was wrong. They didn't thank me. They replaced me. I remember the call from my doctor, coming in just minutes before a major vendor negotiation. More bad news. The treatment would have to intensify. I asked Northbridge if I could work remotely for a few weeks while I handled the next stage. The CEO nodded, said he appreciated my dedication. But behind that nod, I now know plans were already in motion to cut me out the moment the ink dried on the Mason Tech contract. They didn't say I was too old, or too sick, or too close to retirement. Instead, they told me I no longer aligned with the company's evolving culture. And evolving, I assume, meant younger faces, less baggage, and no one quietly shuttling off to chemotherapy during their lunch break. For a long time, I thought I was indispensable not out of ego, but because I held the strings no one else could see. I was the glue between departments, the calm during crises, the steady hand when others hesitated. I thought being good at my job would be enough. But when you get sick, when you get older, when you no longer fit the sleek, hungry mold, they don't just overlook your contributions, they erase them. I learned that day that companies don't want loyalty. They want convenience. And when you become inconvenient even for the right reasons, they'll smile as they hand you the folder, offer a gentle nod, and expect you to vanish quietly. The day it happened wasn't loud or theatrical. There were no slammed doors, no shouting matches, no public meltdowns. Just a quiet knock on my office door that I hadn't even heard. A shadow moving across the frosted glass. And suddenly, Richard Evans, Northbridge's CEO, standing beside Monica from HR, with an expression that was carefully neutral, as if that somehow made what they were about to do more professional. I had just returned from my 3rd round of chemo that morning, trying not to let the nausea show, still dressed in my best navy blazer because I wanted the team to believe everything was normal. We'd closed the Mason Tech deal barely 24 hours ago. My inbox was flooded with congratulatory notes. The client had even sent flowers, addressed specifically to me. And yet, there they stood, Richard with his practiced calm, and Monica with a manila folder that she slid across my desk like a weapon dressed in paperwork. I didn't touch it at first. I just stared at the tab where my name had been typed with precision. I'd seen enough internal memos in my day to know what this was, but I still asked, perhaps out of a need to confirm the surreal. What's this? I managed, even though my stomach was already sinking faster than I could brace myself. Termination documents, Monica replied softly, almost apologetically, though her eyes never quite met mine. Effective immediately. The silence that followed was unbearable. Richard cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably, then launched into a pre-rehearsed explanation about cultural alignment and organizational restructuring. He said it wasn't personal, that the company was evolving, and that sometimes difficult decisions had to be made in order to grow. I almost laughed. I had given everything I had to help this company grow, and now that it had, I was being pruned like a withered branch. But I wasn't withered. I was sick, yes, battling something that most people wouldn't have the courage to whisper aloud, but I was far from done. I'd shown up every day, not out of obligation, but because I still believed in what we were building. I believed in the relationships we'd nurtured, the systems we developed, the trust we'd earned from our partners. What I didn't realize was that somewhere along the way, my success had become a threat, and my illness had become an excuse. Looking back, the signs were all there: Richard growing colder in meetings, projects I once led being redirected for balance, and the final nail, a confidential board presentation that had been mistakenly sent to my inbox just 2 weeks prior. It had outlined the Mason Tech deal in detail, hailed as a strategic milestone led by executive leadership, with not a single mention of me. My nominal conveniently missing from the narrative was being erased while I was still in the room. I should have walked away that day, furious and broken. I should have shouted, demanded answers, begged for fairness, but I didn't. I was too tired for theatrics, too seasoned to grovel. So when Monica handed me the small, generic cardboard box for my personal items, I didn't argue. I nodded, picked up the folder, and calmly began packing 7 years of memories into something not much sturdier than a grocery bag. "You're taking this remarkably well," Monica whispered. I didn't answer. What was the point? She wasn't really looking for a response. Richard stepped out to give me privacy, and as the door clicked shut behind him, I allowed myself one small moment of stillness. Then, as my hand slid over the soft leather of my old notebook I always kept in the top drawer for moments of clarity, I felt the faint outline of the USB drive I'd stashed there months ago. It wasn't out of paranoia. It was instinct. Years in this industry had taught me that when power shifts, memory fades, and I didn't intend to be forgotten. As I walked out, heads turned. My team, who had gathered earlier for a toast, now stood frozen, their champagne untouched, eyes darting between me and the corner office like they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Jamal, my assistant, loyal to the core, rushed forward and wrapped me in a hug that said more than any goodbye ever could. "This isn't right," he muttered. I didn't disagree. Security escorted me to the lobby, their presence unnecessary but symbolic, as if I might cause a scene. But I didn't. I walked tall, the box cradled in my arms like a final offering. I passed the conference room where the glasses still sparkled under overhead lights, and where my name, though never spoken, still lingered in the air like unfinished business. Once inside my car, I finally exhaled. My hands trembled not from anger, but from clarity. This wasn't just betrayal, it was an attempted erasure. But what they failed to realize was that I wasn't just an employee, I was an architect. I had built parts of Northbridge with my own hands, often stitching together chaos left by others and presenting it back as strategy. I had documented every major decision, every contract, every ounce of IP I had ever contributed, and much of it they had taken for granted. That USB in my pocket wasn't leverage. It was a record, a truth they didn't think I'd have the foresight to preserve. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I simply laid the folder out on my kitchen island, poured myself a glass of why not champagne this time, and opened my laptop. The legal oversight was glaring. Buried in the acquisition terms I had signed just hours before the termination, there was a clause small, precise, and utterly powerful. I retained temporary power of attorney over the Mason Tech integration for the next 17 days. It was meant as a formality, a bridge to ensure client continuity. But what they hadn't anticipated was that I knew exactly how that bridge had been built. 17 days. 17 days of access. 17 days where, legally, I wasn't just a former employee. I was still a gatekeeper. And Richard? He had just handed me the match, thinking the fire had already gone out. I wish I could say the betrayal felt like a sudden knife to the back, quick and clean. But the truth is, it was slower more, like realizing the water you're standing in is boiling only after it's too late to step out. It started with the silence. After the termination, no one called. No one from leadership checked in. No messages from the people I had mentored or covered for. The congratulatory emails about the Mason Tech deal stopped abruptly, as if the moment I walked out the door, my name had been purged from the company's collective memory. But the silence wasn't what broke me. It was what I found 2 days later, while sifting through my inbox, organizing documents, and archiving contracts I had authored. Tucked between flagged emails and calendar alerts for meetings I'd no longer attend, there it was, a digital ghost. an internal memo that had been mistakenly CC'd to my personal email address during the chaos of transition. It was titled Executive Summary, Mason Tech Strategic Acquisition, and the moment I opened it, my stomach turned to stone. 12 pages. Detailed timelines, revenue projections, leadership strategy, charts outlining integration phases, and on every page, Richard Evans' name, sometimes highlighted, often praised. Mine, not a single mention, not as lead negotiator, not as contributor, not even as an attendee to the countless meetings I had single-handedly carried when Richard was either late, unprepared, or simply not in the room. At first, I reread it to see if I'd missed something. Maybe a mention in the appendix, a footnote, a thank you slide, anything. But it was as if I had never existed in the process at all. My contributions 6 months of strategy, travel, sleepless nights, and sacrifices made while fighting cancer had been stripped away, absorbed into Richard's version of events where he alone had secured the deal. The realization hit like a second diagnosis. I had been used, and now that I was no longer useful, I was being erased. The hurt came not just from the omission, but from the intention behind it. This wasn't an oversight. It was calculated. Richard had waited until the deal was signed, until the money was wired, until my work had fully ripened. Then, and only then, did he move to cut me out-timed just before bonus season, before performance reviews, before the commission I had rightly earned would need to be acknowledged. It wasn't just professional sabotage. It was personal theft. And I knew it wasn't just about money. No, Richard didn't care about the bonus. He cared about control. I had always made him uncomfortable, not because I was confrontational, but because I didn't rely on him to be excellent. In meetings, clients responded to me, not him. On calls, they addressed their concerns to me, trusting my straightforward answers over his rehearsed charm. And in boardrooms, while I deferred credit to him to keep the peace, everyone knew where the real insight came from. But that balance, that quiet understanding that I would prop him up so long as he left me space to do my work, was fragile, and my illness had cracked it. The moment I showed vulnerability, Richard saw an opening. He didn't have to compete with me anymore. He could simply eliminate the comparison. The final insult came as I packed the last of my things and handed in my badge. He had the nerve to offer a handshake and say, "The board thinks you've become difficult to collaborate with, too independent, not quite a team player." I stared at him, numb from the indignity, and understood exactly what he meant. I made him look bad by being good. I made him irrelevant by being essential. And for men like Richard, there is no greater threat than a woman who no longer needs their approval. I didn't cry on the drive home. I didn't scream into my pillow or call a friend to vent. Instead, I sat in my quiet kitchen, where the evening sun spilled across the countertop like it had on so many nights when I'd worked late to perfect yet another proposal. I poured a second glass of wine, opened my notebook, and flipped back through old meeting notes pages filled with decisions I'd shaped, crises I'd averted, and names of vendors and partners who trusted me, not the company, not Richard. Then, almost without thinking, I opened the folder Monica had given me. It felt cold, bureaucratic, just legal language dressed in polite detachment. But buried in the jargon, in the transition clause tied to the Mason Tech deal, I found the oversight. For 17 days, I still held legal proxy over the technical onboarding process. It wasn't just ceremonial. It granted me actual access to vendor systems, client portals, and data flow governance. It was written to ensure continuity, not realizing I was the continuity. That moment didn't feel like revenge. It felt like justice revealing itself. I wasn't going to retaliate out of spite. I was going to reclaim what was mine, not just recognition, but the dignity that had been stolen the moment Richard decided that my illness made me expendable. 17 days, 17 windows of opportunity. They thought they had shut me out. What they didn't realize was that I had never needed to knock. In the days that followed, I didn't make noise. I didn't post cryptic messages online or leak bitter comments to former colleagues. I didn't curse Richard's name over whiskey in some dark corner booth. Instead, I returned to what I knew best: quiet, deliberate preparation. After all, revenge, when rooted in pain and clarity, doesn't scream. It sharpens. Each morning, I rose with the discipline I had carried for decades. Cancer be damned. And returned to my desk not the sleek glass one at Northbridge, but the old walnut slab in my home office where I had once brainstormed ideas that later made them millions. I opened my laptop, inserted the USB drive I had once tucked away, just in case, and began reviewing everything: contracts, code repositories, vendor agreements, performance logs, and more importantly, the files I had authored, protected, and, in some cases, registered under my own consulting LLC before ever handing them to Northbridge. It wasn't out of pettiness or spite. It was about remembering who I was before they made me feel disposable. I had written much of the foundational backend for their flagship integration suite during a time when no one else on the team could understand the complexity of Mason Tech's systems. When Northbridge needed someone to bridge the gap between engineering and enterprise vision, I stepped in not because it was in my job description, but because I could. And when that software became central to our platform's success, I was asked to relicense my original libraries under Northbridge's name. I did, but with terms legally binding that no one in legal ever truly read. That was their mistake. 17 days. That was all I had under the transition clause of 17 days, where I remained, in the eyes of the law, a temporary agent of record with system access permissions and fiduciary duties tied directly to the Mason Tech account. 17 days in which I was neither employee nor outsider, just a ghost in the machine who still held the keys they didn't even know they left behind. By day 2, I had mapped out every asset I was still tied to: licensing portals that required my approval, integration endpoints dependent on credentials stored under my profile, encryption keys signed with my digital fingerprint. Nothing illegal, nothing underhanded, just the byproduct of years of them assuming I wouldn't keep records, that I would be too trusting, too quiet, too grateful to be included. What they failed to see was that my silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. I began by revoking access not to punish, but to reassert ownership. I disabled one endpoint after another, not all at once, but in a sequence that mirrored routine system updates. I watched as internal alerts trickled into their dashboards, subtle enough to look like server bugs or routine failures, but persistent enough to disrupt performance. I knew the cadence of their diagnostics. I had designed half of them. They wouldn't suspect sabotage. Not yet. At 3:42 a.m. on the 4th night, my phone buzzed Jamal. Something's wrong. The platform's glitching. Richard's losing it. I didn't respond. I just leaned back, stared at the terminal log still cascading across my screen, and whispered to the dark, "It's starting." I wasn't looking to destroy Northbridge. I was looking to force it to acknowledge the truth. You can erase someone from the team list, strip their name from a slide deck, and walk them out the building like yesterday's garbage, but if the infrastructure is built with their hands, the DNA doesn't vanish just because the ego in the corner office wants it to. Each evening, I worked in silence. While the world assumed I was recovering from both illness and humiliation, I was, in fact, orchestrating the cleanest form of consequence, measured, calculated, and entirely within the bounds of the agreements they had signed and ignored. The more I peeled back, the more I realized how deeply embedded I had been in every layer of that company's success. Not out of vanity, but because I had always filled in the gaps left by men like Richardman, who presented vision without substance, who needed someone behind them making the impossible seem seamless. By day 6, vendors began reaching out, not to Northbridge, but to me. They were confused, unable to renew credentials, unsure who to speak to now that my name was no longer valid in their systems. Most of them hadn't even been told I'd been terminated, and when I explained calmly, without bitterness, that I was no longer with the company, their tone shifted. Some were sympathetic, others furious, but all of them began asking the same question. So, who's in charge now? The answer, of course, was no one. What Richard failed to understand was that relationships are currency, and I had spent years investing in mine. Not with corporate charm or branded emails, but with late-night calls, candid advice, and genuine accountability. Vendors remembered that. Clients remembered that. And as Northbridge stumbled, struggling to recover access to systems they barely understood, the ripple began. I made no announcement. I didn't leak any details. I didn't have to. Because sometimes, when you've been burned by betrayal, you don't rise from the ashes by screaming into the wind. You rise by gathering every ember, every spark, every forgotten match, and Then you build the fire they never thought you'd dare to light again. The truth is, I hadn't planned to go this far. I never woke up dreaming of revenge, but sometimes justice demands more than silence, and dignity, while noble, can only protect you so far when predators mistake it for weakness. I didn't start the war, but I wasn't going to be its casualty either. Not when I had the truth, the tools, and just enough time left to wield them wisely. By the 12th day, the atmosphere at Northbridge had shifted from confusion to full-blown chaos. Internal systems continued to falter in strange, inconsistent patterns. Vendor communications were erratic, and client dashboards, many of which were tied to back-end architectures I had helped license under my personal LLC, were failing without any obvious triggers. The beauty of it was in the design. Nothing I did was malicious. I didn't hack anything. I didn't destroy or leak confidential data. All I did was withdraw what was rightfully mine, and without it, the skeleton they built to stand on my shoulders began to buckle. Richard tried to spin it, of course. His ego would never allow him to admit what was happening, let alone why. He blamed the IT department first, then turned on external contractors, and eventually accused the transition team of gross incompetence. But it was too late. The foundation had already started to crumble, and cracks don't care about who's shouting when the structure fails. I knew I had to act while the pieces were still midair, not yet fallen. So I composed an anonymous email, short but surgical, addressed to Northbridge's lead investor, Alan Cho, and blind copied 2 other key shareholders. The subject line read, Clause 9C, Client Safeguards, Risk Exposure Review. The body of the message contained just one sentence. Has the board been briefed on the performance thresholds outlined in subsection 9C of the MasonTech acquisition contract? I suggest a review before the 30-day mark. That single clause, buried deep in a 130-page agreement, had been my final gift to the company before my forced departure clause I wrote myself, couched in legalese and crafted to look like standard compliance language. But its meaning was razor sharp. If certain performance metrics weren't met within the first 30 days, uptime stability, data flow continuity, and vendor engagement validation, the full $18 million from MasonTech would be legally subject to reversal. I remember writing it late one night in my office, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly as I stared at the contract draft and realized I had one chance to build a safety net not for the company, but for myself. Richard had never even read that section. I knew it because he'd skimmed the summary I gave him and signed the deal while checking his phone. The investors, however, read everything, especially when money was at stake. Within 24 hours of my email, a firestorm ignited. Richard was summoned into an emergency board meeting that he didn't call and wasn't allowed to chair. Alan Cho, known for his meticulous calm, flew in from San Francisco with a legal team and a stack of printouts. And while I wasn't in the room, word traveled quickly, especially through Jamal, who by now had become my unofficial inside reporter. They're asking him why you were fired before Clause 9C was fulfilled, he texted. He's sweating through his shirt. It's brutal. It was more than brutal, it was necessary. These men had enabled Richard's arrogance because he had hidden behind numbers I had generated and success I had architected. Now they were watching those numbers collapse in real time, and they were beginning to understand who had actually been holding the reins. By the 14th day, media whispers had started to stir. A few insider blogs had caught wind of the Northbridge debaclenoth in concrete. Just speculation about executive shakeups and mysterious client-side failures. I didn't speak to the press. I didn't need to. Instead, I made 3 calls to 3 former clients who had always asked for me by name and quietly let them know I was consulting independently again. All 3 requested meetings. None of them mentioned Richard. And then came the breaking point. A junior developer, someone I barely knew, but must have respected the truth, leaked a screen recording from 6 months ago during a MasonTech strategy call. In the video, Richard cuts me off mid-sentence, misrepresents technical details, and finishes with the kind of smug line that sticks like a shard in the spine. Harper tends to get too emotional about the code. That's why she's not in leadership. I hadn't known it was recorded. I hadn't even realized how visibly I bit my tongue until I saw the footage myself. It went viral within 12 hours. I didn't say anything right away. I waited until the flood of comments had turned into a movement, until Justice for Harper started trending across tech Twitter. Then I posted a single line underneath the video. He said I was too emotional to lead. Turns out, emotion builds empires. 500,000 likes later, My silence finally broke. It didn't unravel all at once. Truth rarely does. It seeps in, slipping through the cracks of carefully built lies, until the foundation starts to tremble beneath the weight of what it tried so desperately to hide. Richard thought he could spin the narrative, that with the right phrasing and just enough industry jargon, he could cast me as an unstable former executive, someone who had become erratic, unpredictable, and perhaps even dangerous in the final stretch of her career. He forgot that memory is longer than spin, and that people who build their reputations on integrity tend to have more than their own voices defending them. By the time the video clip circulated his smug dismissal of my technical judgment during a client meeting, his offhand comment about me being too emotional to lead, the tide had already begun to shift. The clip wasn't explosive on its own. It wasn't scandalous or edited for drama. It was raw and mundane in a way that made it hit harder. There I was, calmly trying to explain a systems integration flaw, only to be interrupted, corrected, and belittled by a man who had clearly never written a line of code in his life. The intern who leaked it later said she hadn't planned to post it, but after watching what happened to me, she couldn't sleep knowing that this had become normal. The public reaction was immediate and merciless, not because I had asked for it, but because people recognized something they had seen in their own careers, their own lives. They saw a woman silenced in real time, her knowledge dismissed, her presence minimized, and they connected it to every meeting where they had been talked over, every achievement that had been co-opted, every quiet moment when they swallowed their pride to keep the peace. My inbox flooded with strangers, engineers, nurses, teachers, even retired firefighters each, writing to say some version of, "That clip? That was me too." But as powerful as the public response was, it was nothing compared to what began happening behind the scenes. I had already sent a voice recording to Northbridge's primary investor, Alan Cho, a snippet from a conversation months earlier, recorded legally, in which Richard had plainly said, "Once this closes, the board will think it was my victory. That's how this works, Harper. I'm the CEO. The wins belong to me." I had remained calm in the recording, my voice steady as I replied, "That doesn't seem fair, Richard." And his final chuckledry, condescending, definitive, was the nail in his own coffin. "Fair? This is business. Grow up." Alan didn't respond directly. He didn't have to. I had worked with him long enough to know that silence from him wasn't indifference, it was calculation. And it wasn't long before the call started. Not to me, but to every board member, every major investor, every partner with financial skin in Northbridge's unraveling game. Still, I didn't stop there. Over the course of several days, I began releasing selected pieces of documentation, nothing confidential, nothing proprietary, just enough to make the pattern unmistakable. Screenshots of Richard ignoring compliance flags, dismissing concerns raised by legal, mocking vendors behind their backs, and bragging in internal messages about how easy it was to take credit for others' work. In one particularly damning exchange, he'd typed, "Let Harper deal with the boring tech junk. She's good at that. I'll handle the boardroom stuff where it actually counts." That line was screen captured, shared, and reshared by professionals across the industry like it was a war banner. The tone inside Northbridge began to shift, where once there had been admiration or at least fear, there was only suspicion and doubt. Jamal texted me from time to time with updates. Executives no longer lingered in the cafeteria, meetings were being held in hushed corners, and LinkedIn profiles were quietly being updated across departments. The confidence Richard once wore like armor was now starting to crack, and behind it, everyone could see the man who had always been hiding, a man who had climbed on the backs of others and convinced himself it was leadership. The final blow didn't come from a leaked file or a trending hashtag. It came from Melissa. Yes, that malicious HR director who had handed me my termination papers with a polite smile and a steady hand, facing the possibility of her own legal exposure during the now active SEC inquiry. She chose to come forward, not to protect me, but to protect herself. And in doing so, she delivered the final, undeniable piece of the story. She turned over emails time-stamped, detailed, damning, that showed Richard had made the decision to fire me the day after the Mason Tech deal closed, specifically to avoid paying out the contractually agreed bonus and commission. The internal justification she had been instructed to use? Cultural misalignment. Her testimony transformed what was once a quiet exit into something far more dangerous, a retaliatory termination tied directly to financial fraud. The documents were submitted, reviewed, and entered into the record. Within hours, my attorney filed suit on my behalf, wrongful termination. reputational harm, unpaid compensation. The headlines were no longer whispers. They were thunder. And I didn't gloat. I didn't run victory laps or hold press conferences. I simply went for a walk in my neighborhood, wrapped in a coat I had nearly donated during chemo because it felt too heavy, too unnecessary, too much like hope. And that afternoon, for the first time in a long while, I let the winter air fill my lungs, steady and full, knowing that I had not only survived, but I had been heard. They say starting over at my age is like planting a garden in late autumn, uncertain, perhaps futile. But they forget that the most resilient things often bloom after the frost, not before it. I didn't set out to build a company. I simply wanted to create a space where people like Methos who had been silenced, overlooked, or quietly discarded could find their voices again and use them without fear of being talked over. So, on the 17th day, the last day I legally held transition authority over the Mason Tech integration, I registered Varela Systems, a name born from a dream I once had as a younger woman when ambition was still something I carried without shame. I opened the bank account with my own money, modest but meaningful, and signed the founding documents under soft afternoon light at a co-working desk in a borrowed office space that smelled faintly of espresso and new beginnings. The investors came quickly, some cautiously, others decisively. They'd seen what I had done with nothing but time, knowledge, and the fine print everyone else had ignored. They weren't betting on revenge. They were betting on resilience. And while Richard's empire continued its slow, collapse-bleeding clients, credibility, and legal ground, I was building something that no one could take credit for but me. By the end of our third week, Varela had 7 employees, 5 of whom had walked out of Northbridge quietly and asked only for a chance to do meaningful work again. Jamal was the first to arrive, sliding into our temporary office with his signature calm and a box full of old notebooks and fresh energy. Maria from product joined next, followed by Trevor, the former CFO, whose departure from Northbridge had been cloaked in corporate politeness but driven by conscience. Together, we started designing what we believe technology should be: clear, accountable, and collaborative. I didn't want just to compete. I wanted to redefine what ethical tech leadership looked like. And slowly, as days blurred into late nights filled with whiteboards and takeout and hard questions asked with trust instead of fear, the company took shape. We weren't loud, but we were unmistakably alive. Then came the tipping point. One of the clients who had once pulled out of Northbridge due to unexplained system instability reached out. Their CTO had seen the media storm, watched the video clip, read the court filings, and still, what caught his attention most was a quiet LinkedIn post I had written that simply said, "Sometimes you don't rebuild the bridge. You build the island." He wanted to meet. We met over coffee. 1 week later, Varela Systems signed its first major contract, a $30 million agreement that, just months earlier, would have gone straight into Richard's padded pocket. The news broke the same day Northbridge formally filed for bankruptcy protection. The headlines almost wrote themselves. Rising from the fire. Fired executive launches ethical tech firm as former employer crumbles. I didn't smile out of cruelty. I smiled because for the first time in a long time, I felt free. We hosted a rooftop gathering that evening, just our small team and a few close allies under hanging lights and stars that blinked through the fading Minneapolis skyline. Trevor raised a glass and said, to Diane, who reminded us that standing your ground isn't just the right thing to do, it's smart business. I looked around at the people who had chosen courage over comfort and risked their reputations to follow something untested, and I felt, in the deepest part of my chest, that we had already won. Later, as the last of the laughter drifted into the quiet, Maria turned to me and asked, if Richard ever reached out again, what would you say to him? I didn't answer right away. I just looked out across the city, remembering everything the moment the folder hit my desk, the days of silence, the USB drive burning in my coat pocket like a secret. Then I lifted my glass and said, thanks for the fire. I forged something better in it. She nodded, eyes shining, and whispered, to fire and to forging. To anyone out there listening, anyone who's ever been told they're too old, too emotional, too something to lead, to matter, to rise, I want you to hear this. You are not finished. You are not invisible. You are not done. If this story meant something to you, share it. And if you're ready, tell your story next.